Hi everyone, I'm Cody Rue. This is the Church of Logic. I've been a little sick lately, but that didn't have to be the case. I could have made different decisions or been in a different spot and not been sick. That would have been nice. Logic doesn't really say much about this. Logic just says, hey, there are things that are true. If I am sick, then I am sick. If I was sick, on Christmas, then I was sick on Christmas. There's nothing really you can do about that. But intuitively, we can imagine a world in which I hadn't been sick. And in fact, we can imagine consequences of that world. In classical logic, you can sort of say things like, if I hadn't been sick on Christmas, then I'd be a billionaire. Intuitively, that's not really true, right? There's no real reason for me to be rich if I hadn't been sick. There's no consequence of me being sick that makes me, as poor as I am. But in classical logic, material implication says if you take something that is false, then it will imply anything, regardless of the relationship between those things. That's kind of counterintuitive. In mathematics, that's fine. There are things that are true in mathematics, there are things that are false, or at least provable and refutable. But in everyday life, things are a little bit squishier. Things that are true don't feel like they're really necessarily true, and things that are not the case don't feel like, they're necessarily not the case. So how do we kind of cope with that? Well, one way to cope with that is just say, hey, logic doesn't apply to the real world. It doesn't say anything about what is true or possibly true or necessarily true. Or you could do what logicians did in the early 20th century and try to develop a logic of possibility and necessity. A logician called Lewis did this, I think in 1912, started developing a theory. But this idea of using logic to talk about possibility is much older. Some people claim it goes all the way back to Aristotle. Logicians managed to create this symbolic world where they could reason about consequences and distinguish those from necessary consequences or possible consequences. To do that, they introduced this operator that is written as a square and that I will just call box. That operator intuitively meant that somehow some truth was necessary rather than being what's called contingent, sort of true by happenstance. So if I say that I was necessarily sick, in symbolic logic that would say, box, I am sick. All right? What's kind of interesting is that then you can define another really reasonable operator called possibly and written diamond. And if I say it was possible for me to be sick, what logicians took as the definition of that given box was just saying it was not necessary for me to be not sick. So non-necessarily non, so using the normal negation operator, not box not, is the same as this diamond, this possibility operator. And that's pretty reasonable. And then, okay, you have this box, you sort of want to try to reason about these necessary truths, these possible truths. And, how do you do it? I talked about possible worlds in a previous podcast, but possible worlds is kind of a semantics. You're already dictating what these things must be. I think it's much more exciting and interesting to say, hey, let's look at this notion of, this box, this notion of necessity, and let's try to imagine what things must be true of it. And then let's use ordinary first-order logic to try to derive consequences of this. So logicians did exactly this, and they came up with a bunch of axioms for this box operator, and also logical rules. Now remember, logical rules are things that allow you to build new proofs, and axioms are also a way to build new proofs, but they're a very simple way, which is just the axiom could always be taken as, immediately true. It's sort of an immediate leaf proof. All right. So one of these rules, let's start with the axioms. There are some fun ones. One is that box A, so if necessarily A is true, then diamond A, so possibly A is true. If necessarily A is true, then possibly A is true. That feels kind of reasonable. Another one that's a little bit stronger is box A implies A. If A is necessarily true, then, A is true. That also seems reasonable, but it's a little bit stronger. Another one that's a little bit less intuitive is if box A, then box A. If it's necessarily true that A, then necessarily it's necessarily true than A. That seems a little bit, not that interesting, because who cares about the necessity of necessity? But of course, the answer is logicians. Logicians care a lot about this kind of stuff. So they start adding these boxes and diamonds. Another one is if A is true, then necessarily it's possible for A to be true. There's a bunch of other ones, like it is necessarily true that if A is necessarily true, then A is true. That one's kind of weird. All right, so we take all these axioms and then we add the following rule, which is a little subtle, which is to say if A is derivable, if we can prove A without any hypotheses, basically if A is a tautology, then box A should also be derivable. In some sense, this is saying a logical truth, a thing that can be taken to be true without any assumptions, is always necessarily true. So me being sick is not something that's necessarily true without any assumptions. But the fact that if I am sick, then I am not sick, that's a tautology. It's a necessary truth. And therefore, it is necessary that if I am sick, then I am not sick. All right? So with these rules, logicians started to think about what things we could possibly derive. And they also tried to think about, what are axioms that are good for this notion of necessity? Or maybe there are other things we can use to interpret these boxes and these diamonds. So I talked already about many world semantics, but this is kind of a good way to think about it for philosophers. Philosophers are like, hey, let's imagine different universes and us moving between these different universes. And maybe the universes are similar but a little bit different, like in that show Sliders, if you've seen it. It's a great show. I recommend it. You go into a different universe. You go into a universe where I hadn't been sick on the 25th, and you see what's different, right? And in some ways, the fact that such a universe exists could be taken as the possibility, right? If this universe exists, then it's possibly true for me to not be sick on the 25th. Of course, we don't actually know about alternate universes. What we do know about is time, right? Time is kind of a different universe, if you think about it, not too hard. We can say, hey, I was sick on a Tuesday. But you can imagine that every Tuesday is a different Tuesday universe. And saying that I'm sick on a Tuesday, we can examine those different Tuesdays and say, hey, it's not necessary for me to be sick because there have been plenty of Tuesdays where I wasn't sick. So this kind of is a way to reason about necessity and possibility, and it's also a way to think about the semantics of necessity. If in the future, at all times, this thing will be true, then, it's a necessary truth. It's a box truth. If in the future it will be true that something happens, that's a possibility. It's a diamond truth. Now note that I say will be and not maybe, right? In this world of time, seeing time as the modality, we still talk about truths as absolutes and not like potentialities because we haven't really defined what it means to be potentially true. All right. These interpretations are fun, and they're actually kind of useful. I think philosophers developed this just to do philosophy, which we don't necessarily consider to be very practical. But if you look at Box as, truth in the future, and as Diamond as true at some point in the future, this is actually really useful for pragmatic needs, right? If you're building a car, right, and you're building a control system for the car, you might want to know that, in every world in which I press the brake pedal, the brakes are going to engage, right? So engineers use this kind of logic, these kind of modal logics, to reason about these temporal properties. And that's one of the big applications of modal logic in engineering. But, okay, that's the pragmatics. I think the fun is to try to imagine more subtle things, like these possible universes that we could move between. What's kind of cool is that these axioms give different rules for the universes. If I can move through universes back and forth in every direction, then in some sense, I'm giving a kind of an ordering on these possible worlds, right? I can move to one universe and then I can move back. Now, an interpretation of Box that supports this moving back to a universe would be kind of described as an order, or a symmetric relationship between the universes, right? I can go forward and backwards, and any modal logic, any potentiality that talks about the symmetry between possible worlds, will satisfy the axiom A implies Box Diamond A, which is to say, if A is true, then it is necessarily possibly true that A. So that weird axiom I talked about earlier is kind of an axiom that's supported in a certain mode of possible world semantics. For example, another example is if you're thinking about time, right? Something that is going to be Box true, so necessarily true, will be true at all points in time, including the present. And this is a characteristic of reflexive universes, right? The potential universes contain the current ones. And that one is exactly validated by the axiom Box A implies A. So we have this relationship between the possible worlds and how they relate to each other, and the axioms that we take in our modal logic. Now here, in my opinion, is the funnest interpretation of modal logic. Interpret Box as moral necessity. It is morally imperative for you to do something, means Box A. If I have to do A to be a good person, then Box A. And now you can see that Diamond, as its definition of not Box not, means it is not morally necessary for you to not do something. And what does that mean? That means it's permitted to do the thing, right? If it's not, forbidden to do something, then it's permitted. And so now philosophers of morality can actually do logic, right? They can say, Box A means you have to do A. Diamond A means, yeah, this is allowed. And now you can start reasoning about this. Now, however, this Box A implies A means if something is morally necessary, then it is the case, right, in the real world. But that, of course, is not a good axiom for Box as moral obligation, right? Because it's not the case that everybody does exactly the things they are morally obligated to do. We know that all too well. So they usually weaken that axiom with Box A implies Diamonds A, which is to say, if something is morally imperative, then certainly it's allowed, right? If I am morally obligated to save kittens from the pound, then, it's allowed to save kittens from the pound, certainly. So, okay. All these different interpretations of modal logic have been hotly debated and lead to really interesting philosophical problems, but also interesting mathematical problems. And as I've suggested but not really explained, there's a strong correspondence between these possible world semantics and the different axioms that are validated, by those semantics. And this is a fascinating area of research, and people still do this out there. And finally, there are strong applications of this kind of reasoning in everyday life, including engineering. I think this is a fun thing to think about, and I might talk about it more in the future. But until then, I hope you have a great New Year's.